On the floating island of Neo Verona, Leontes Montague has led a coup that took over the entire island and stripped power away from House Capulet, with young Juliet escaping. 14 years later, Leontes rules the land with an iron fist and crushes anyone who opposes him. Juliet, now 16, fights against House Montague's oppression as the masked vigilante, the Red Whirlwind. During the Rose Ball, hosted by the Montagues, Juliet meets young Romeo, Prince Montague's son, and both of them fall deeply in love. Romeo is also against the tyranny that his father has created in this land of beauty. Their ideals, their thoughts, and their love grow more and more each day that they spend with each other. Unfortunately, Capulet loyalists are planning a rebellion to overthrow House Montague, with Lord Montague planning on ending House Capulet permanently, once and for all. These two must face revolution together and try to have their love survive. Romeo X Juliet is an anime adaptation based loosely on the works of William Shakespeare's most famous play, Romeo and Juliet. Yet by taking the same basic characters, concepts, and overall backdraft, but changing it just enough to make its own creative process, it asks the question, how can alterations change intent of the original? In order to appreciate what an adaptation is, we have to first look at the original works in which it's based upon. In this case, it is William Shakespeare, arguably the greatest writer who ever lived, creating works that to this day still stand the test of time and are still recognized as masterpieces that are taught in schools even now. Romeo and Juliet, at its core, is a love story, while it is also portrayed as a massive tragedy, not necessarily about the love that they had and lost, but the fact that they threw their lives away for what consequently was seemingly nothing. And with the backdrop of betrayal, royalty, lust, and heightened love at first sight concepts, it cemented what it could be to be in a romantic relationship. But it overlooks things that many people don't really think about until they look back at the original works from a critical lens. Romeo and Juliet is probably the most well-known love story that ever existed. Every love story involving two differing sides that don't get along, but eventually fall in love with each other, is a story that seemingly is as old as time, but really it started with Shakespeare and it still resonates with people to this very day, because it takes the human concept of relationships, love, caring, hatred, and every emotion that you could think of involving a relationship, passions that anyone can relate to that have ever been in a relationship. That is the mastery and the impact that Shakespeare had. He was the first writer to take these same basic core principles and bring them into the forefront of people's minds. No one had ever really approached it in the way that he had done, to talk about it in a way that people could both relate to and also be processing as an audience. The impact in which Romeo and Juliet has played cannot be understated as far as the work of fiction, especially involving romance. Reiko Yoshida created Romeo X Juliet. While not as skilled as the bard, in the scope of anime, her abilities are not to be understated. Having worked on such vastly different anime series as Get Backers, Kaleidostar, D. Greyman, K-On!, Genshiken, and Bakuman, just to name a few. Her skill set is not limited to one specific genre, just like the bard himself. But while working on this, she is appreciative of what the story itself is, but instead of focusing on the romance as the core central of the story, like every adaptation of this story has done, she decided to take it in a vastly different direction. Romeo X Juliet is a romance series. Yes, at its core, just like every adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, it is. However, it has very different aspects that play a central figure in the story's conflict. In the original, the conflict between the Capulets and Montagues was more of just a setup for the romance of Romeo and Juliet. In Romeo X Juliet, it's not just a setup. It is the central conflict between them. It is the thing that focuses the primary subject of the story. Why do they have a conflict? Why do they want to do things? It holds secrets that I'm sure the bard never intended when writing in the original script. All of William Shakespeare's plays have been adapted in some way, shape, or form in every single form of media. From Macbeth, to Hamlet, to, of course, Romeo and Juliet. But what makes each adaptation vastly different isn't what media it is, it's the execution. To take the central core idea of what the play itself is about, changing it vastly, or changing it slightly, doing it in a different setting, doing it in a different medium, focusing more on changing things completely while staying true to the original source material. These are conflicts that not only centrally work around William Shakespeare's adaptations, but also every form of adaptation. And here, in the anime series Romeo X Juliet, although it may seem blasphemous, in some regards, it's executed better than the source material. Reason being is because it took directions that the source material never even touched upon, like the conflict of hiding your identity, the aspect of Juliet not just being some beautiful woman who falls in love with Romeo, but is actually a warrior, a person who wants to fight alongside those in a revolution, not just sitting on the sidelines. But she's also concerned with how society would see her fighting alongside men, especially in that period of time. Romeo isn't just a complicit person who just follows his father's orders. He's a free thinker, he's passionate, he's caring, he's understanding of the plight of the many and the plight of himself and his own families. These central conflicts aren't just obsoletes and just blank statements for them to get from one direction to the other. Now, that's not to say that the original source material did this either, but it's the execution of the new style that allows it to stand on its own, and allows many people who may not even like Shakespeare to see this version and see it for what it is a loving tribute that does its own thing. So, how can alterations change intent of the original? When something is adapted, something has to be changed. Something has to either be erased, rewritten, or simplified. It's just the nature of adapting. In order for it to be consumable, it needs to be smaller, it needs to be more digestible. But it's also important to appreciate not just the original works, but what other adaptations did or failed to do. It's important to not just see the original creator, but appreciate those that did something different, that did something unique. For better or worse, the execution can be done poorly, or it can succeed where the original may have failed. Ultimately, the core difference is to the individual. I'm sure there are books that many have read that were turned into movies or films or TV, and some that were so passionate about the original source material, when it becomes an adaptation, they feel almost slighted, almost offended when something goes awry, when something goes wrong, when something they feel at their core does not resonate with them as a passion to the original. But in the same way, it's also a matter of the person who watched this may never have seen the original source material, may not even honestly care about the original source material, and just see the thing as it is. And both points are equally valid. The key to alteration is to know that at its core, both new and old, that media as a whole is not solidifying. It is adaptable, it is interchangeable, it is constantly evolving, and that alterations can both make or break from the source material, but it doesn't take away the expressive fact that each version, for better or worse, are forms of art. But in the end, these aren't answers, they're hypertheticals.
Perhaps some questions man isn't meant to answer. Trust the priesthood. Release the brothers into my custody.
Put my questions on a shelf. Respectfully, sir, I'm not detaining the Lafferty brothers for a questioning mine. I'm investigating a murder.
We've all made covenants to protect the Lord's kingdom, even unto laying down our lives. Now, we wouldn't want anything to embarrass the church, would we, brother? I trust you recall the repercussions of sharing what is heaven's alone.